When Isabella Voss started college, she weighed 90 pounds. She had never tasted chocolate, never touched a slice of birthday cake, never once eaten anything that hadn't been approved by her family's strict vegan code. She was disciplined, she was pure, she was, by every measure her family used, perfect. 13 years later, she would weigh 700 pounds. And the person who started it all? A boy in a philosophy class. Eating a Snickers bar at 8 in the morning. This is the story of how one square of dark chocolate unlocked a life Isabella Voss never knew she was missing, and what happened when she decided she never wanted to stop. The Voss household had one rule above all others. You eat what the earth provides. Every morning, without exception, Isabella woke to the sound of her mother blending spinach and frozen mango downstairs. Green smoothies. Every day. Not a trend, not a suggestion. Law. Her father, Gerald, was tall, lean, and looked a full decade younger than his age. He set quinoa and roasted vegetables at the center of the table and spoke about the body like it was a sacred structure. Something to be maintained, not indulged. Her mother, Miriam, could name every chemical in a processed snack. She carried her own food to other people's birthday parties. She had never, in her entire life, let a child of hers eat a gummy bear. Her two older brothers, Samuel and Cole, ran every morning, read every label, and turned down cake at weddings without flinching. And Isabella? Isabella was 90 pounds of pure discipline. She didn't feel deprived. She genuinely didn't know what she was missing. But that was about to change, because in September of her freshman year at Caldwell University, Isabella Voss sat down an introduction to philosophy and made the mistake of sitting next to Damian Wells. He was eating a Snickers bar at 8 in the morning. Not sneaking it, not guilty about it, not hiding the wrapper under his desk, just eating it like it was the most natural thing in the world. Isabella stared. He noticed. Want some? He held it toward her, completely casual. No, she pulled back slightly. I don't eat that. He raised an eyebrow. He was broad-shouldered, warmly dark-skinned, with a slow smile that made the world seem like it was perpetually amusing to him. You don't eat chocolate? I don't eat processed sugar. Or dairy. Or artificial anything. He looked at her, not rudely, but with the pure curiosity of someone who had just encountered something genuinely fascinating. Why not? Because it's not good for you. He took another bite, unhurried, unbothered. Neither is stress, he said. But here we are. She turned away from him, but she was smiling, just slightly, in a direction where he couldn't see it. She didn't know it yet, but that was the moment the door cracked open, and once it did, would never fully close again. They became friends the way unlikely people always do. Gradually, then suddenly, study sessions in the library that somehow always ended at the campus food court. Damian ordered with the enthusiasm of a man at a festival. Isabella sat across from him with her packed lunch, watching him the way someone watches a film in a foreign language. Fascinated, but not yet ready to participate. You're not curious? He asked one evening, sliding a container of loaded cheese fries toward her. I'm not tempted, she corrected. That's not the same answer. She looked at the fries. Golden. Glistening. Piled with sour cream and green onion and something that smelled aggressively delicious. She pushed them back, but that night, she lay awake thinking about it. Damian had a philosophy. Not recklessness. A philosophy. He had told her once, stretched across the library lawn eating mango sorbet from a cup. Life is too short to confine yourself to that level of discipline. Not every meal needs to be a moral statement. You eat something you love. You let yourself feel it without guilt. That's a kind of freedom most people never get. And then the line that burrowed into her and refused to leave. You will be remembered for what you consume, because you will never go unnoticed. You command attention based on your size, based on your presence. The woman who eats boldly, who lives boldly, who takes up space boldly, she doesn't disappear into a room, she arrives in it. Isabella laughed at that, a little nervously. She had no idea how literal those words would one day become. It was a Tuesday in October. Damian placed a bar of dark chocolate on the desk in front of her 70% cacao without ceremony or pressure. He opened his own and waited. It's technically vegan, he said. No dairy, just chocolate and cane sugar. Think of it as an earth product. Isabella stared at the bar. Inside her head, two voices were arguing. Her mother's. Discipline is important, Isabella. Her own, slowly forming. But moderation is key. Balance is possible. This doesn't have to be betrayal. She picked it up, broke off one square, placed it on her tongue. The world didn't end, her mother didn't appear, her father didn't materialize from thin air. What happened instead was that Isabella Voss closed her eyes, and for the first time in 18 years, she tasted something that had no nutritional agenda, something that existed purely to be enjoyed, something warm and dark and slightly bitter that melted across her tongue and left behind an ache she hadn't known existed. The ache of pleasure that had been waiting patiently her entire life. When she opened her eyes, Damian was watching her with that slow smile. "Well, it's good," she said quietly. He nodded, satisfied. "It gets better from here." He had absolutely no idea how right he was. 90 pounds. That's where she started. It would be the last time she was ever that small. Once the door cracked open, it did not close easily. First it was chocolate, then honey in her tea, then banana bread, warm from the campus bakery, with walnuts on top that crunched between her teeth like a small celebration. Then more. She tried to maintain the balance, the discipline her family gave her, alongside the joy Damian was teaching her. And for a while, she managed it. Salads at lunch, something indulgent at dinner, morning oats, afternoon pastry. But eating had become social in a way it had never been before. There was laughter across the table, splitting dessert at midnight, walking back from food trucks at 2 in the morning, arguing about whether the waffle or the crepe had been better, and feeling deeply, genuinely alive. By the end of freshman year, Isabella weighed 120 pounds. Her parents hadn't seen her yet. She called home less about food. She stopped mentioning what she was eating. Her mother asked once, "Are you keeping up with your greens?" And Isabella said yes, because she still was, sometimes. It wasn't entirely a lie. Then Thanksgiving came. She walked through the front door of the Voss house with a new softness in her face, new curves in her frame, and 3 new dress sizes she hadn't mentioned to anyone. Her brothers stopped mid-conversation. Samuel looked at Cole. Cole looked at the floor. Her father smiled carefully. The smile of a man who was choosing his words before he chose them. And her mother? Her mother looked at Isabella for a long, quiet moment, said absolutely nothing, hugged her. The silence was heavier than anything she could have said, and Isabella knew the conversation was coming. She just didn't know how many more pounds she'd gain before it finally happened. Back at Caldwell, Isabella's world of taste kept expanding. Pasta with cream sauce so rich it coated the back of her spoon. Fried plantains caramelized at the edges, soft in the middle. Cheesecake so creamy the fork left a trail through it before she even lifted the bite. Croissants that left butter on her fingers and flakes on her shirt, and absolutely no regrets. And chocolate, always chocolate, her first love, her constant. Dark, milk, ganache, truffle, lava cake eaten warm at 11 at night, the molten center spilling out like something that had been waiting to be released. At 160 pounds, Isabella looked in the mirror one morning and apologized. To herself, to no one, to the ghost of her mother's green smoothies for the first time. When she told Damian, he just smiled and ordered dessert. "You don't need to apologize for existing," he said, spooning creme brulee across the table toward her. "You need to stop practicing it." She was falling in love with him. She was also falling in love with everything he had introduced her to, and the line between those two things was getting harder to see. Junior year arrived. Isabella weighed 210 pounds. When she walked across campus, people noticed her in a way they hadn't before. Some smiled, some stared. A girl in her sociology class once made a comment. Something half-whispered, something cruel, the kind of thing people say when they think they're being quiet, but aren't. Isabella heard it. She went home that evening and sat on the edge of her bed for a long time. Then she called Damian. And he came over. And he brought chocolate. And they didn't talk about the girl in sociology class, because some things are more powerful when they go unanswered. But the hardest moment came at 280 pounds, when her campus doctor called her in for a routine check. She sat in the vinyl chair across from his desk. He looked at her chart. Then he looked back at her. "We should talk about this," he said. The room was very quiet. Isabella looked at her hands. She thought about her mother's green smoothies. She thought about Damian on the library lawn. She thought about the girl in sociology class, and the look on her brothers' faces at Thanksgiving. And then she thought about the first square of dark chocolate melting on her tongue, The feeling of arriving instead of disappearing. She looked up at the doctor. "I know what you're going to say," she told him, "and I've thought about it. I'm still thinking about it. But I'm not ready to have this conversation yet." She stood up, thanked him, and walked out. It was the most honest thing she had ever said to anyone, and it would be the hardest thing she ever had to keep living with. She went home for Thanksgiving of her junior year at 300 pounds. When she walked through the door, the house went very still. Her brother Samuel set down his glass. Cole looked at the window. Her father stood at the stove and kept his eyes on the pot. Her mother walked up to her, took her face in both hands, the way she had when Isabella was a child, and looked at her for a long moment. Then she let go. They didn't talk about it that night. The next morning, over green smoothies Isabella no longer wanted but accepted anyway. "Are you happy?" her mother asked. Isabella didn't answer immediately. She thought about everything. Damian, midnight crepes, the doctor's office, the girl from sociology, the chocolate bar in October of freshman year. "Yes," she finally said, "I really am. Discipline is important, Isabella." "I know, Mom. But I raised you to know your own mind." A long pause. "I just need to know it's your mind." "It's both," Isabella said. "His ideas and mine. I'm trying to find the balance." Her mother nodded once, reached across the table, squeezed her hand. Did not say she approved, did not say she didn't. It was the most complicated conversation they had ever had, and somehow also the kindest. It was at a community event in the city's east side that Isabella first met Marcus Bell. She was 25 years old and working in urban community development, a career she loved. She was good at walking into rooms and making people feel heard. She commanded attention wherever she went, not just because of her size, but because of what lived inside it. The warmth, the confidence, the woman who had spent years deciding exactly who she was going to be. Marcus arrived in a motorized wheelchair. He was 43, 6 feet tall, and weighed 600 pounds. He entered the room the way a weather system enters a valley, slowly, completely, with authority that made people stop and recalibrate. He introduced himself with a handshake that was warm and deliberate. "I've heard good things about you," he said. They became colleagues. Then friends. Marcus had a philosophy entirely his own, older than Damian's joy-seeking, older than her family's discipline. "People look at me," he told her over lunch one afternoon, "and they decide my whole story in 3 seconds. They decide I'm sad, undisciplined, don't know what I'm doing to myself. But they don't know that I wake up every morning, do my work, love my family, and eat my lunch. My life is full, and full lives have weight." Isabella sat with that. For a very long time. Isabella Voss was 31 years old when she reached 700 pounds. She moved through the world differently than she had at 90 pounds, more slowly, with more accommodation, more logistical consideration for chairs, for distances, for spaces that were not built with her in mind. She did not pretend this was without difficulty. There were hard days. Days her body reminded her of its limits in ways that were not comfortable or poetic. But she was also something she had never been at 90 pounds. Visible. Undeniably, completely, unavoidably visible. She thought sometimes about Damian's words, said to her on a campus lawn she could no longer cross the way she once had, by a boy eating a Snickers bar on the most ordinary Tuesday morning of her life. "You will command attention based on your size." He had meant it as encouragement. He had no idea it would one day be literal. She called her mother every Sunday. Her mother still said moderation, Isabella, every single time, without fail, as if the original conversation had never ended, as if it never would. And Isabella every single time answered, "I know, Mom, I know." She set the phone down, picked up the dark chocolate on the table beside her, 70% cacao, the same kind as the very first time, broke off one square, placed it on her tongue, and sat in the quiet of her living room while it melted. She had started life at 90 pounds, trying to disappear. Now she weighed 700, and for the very first time, she had never felt more visible.